In this video, I'd like to introduce you to the Spring Framework. So a little bit about Spring. It is the most popular Java framework for building enterprise-grade applications. And by enterprise-grade, I mean applications that are highly scalable and reliable. The large websites and whatnot, you're going to see Spring using it. Of the companies using Java, over 60% of them use Spring. I think it's probably higher than that. The way polling is done, often they break out Spring and Spring Boot separately, so the polling data gets a little confusing, but at least 60% of companies are using Spring, probably more. It's evolved and it's been very, very popular amongst Java developers. It is highly popular with banks, financial institutions, and large retailers. Now, Spring traditionally has been used to build traditional monolithic applications. Think where you have web application server farms and you're running some type of web application, and Spring is providing the back end through JSPs and whatnot. But it is also very well suited for modern microservice-based architectures. It has evolved not only to be for monolithic applications, but also microservice. It is commonly used as what is deemed the back-end technology. So if you go to a major website, you're often going to be invoking multiple services behind the browser. Web service calls that your browser will be making will be going to some sort of back-end technology, and quite often that is going to be the Spring Framework. Now, Spring Framework was started way back in 2003 by Rod Johnson. It started as a simpler alternative to J2EE. Rod authored a book called Expert One-on-One, J2EE without EJB. At that time, EJB, or Enterprise Java Beans, was also known as XML Hell. I worked with it. It was awful. I mean, it was quite painful to work with it. There was a lot of ceremony that you had to go through. And Spring came out, and the focus was using plain old Java objects to very highly simplify development. It was such a simpler alternative. That's why when Spring was released in 2004, it quickly became adopted by the Java community. It really had rapid adoption. In 2007, Spring Framework 2.5 was released. This is when annotations came out, so it seems a long time ago, but we find annotations common now. But there was a time where we didn't have them. And in August 2009, Spring Source was purchased by VMware for $420 million, and I suspect Rod did quite well on that. And then in December 2009, Spring 3.0 was released, and this is where we started seeing the Java-based configuration. Up until this time, it was a lot of XML. In 2013, VMware formed a new company with several others called Pivotal, and all Spring applications were moved to this company. So Pivotal still is the supporting company behind Spring. In 2014, Spring Boot 1.0 was released. Quickly after that, Spring Framework 5 was released. So this is really a feature-rich release of Spring. Major libraries were released to introduce reactive programming. And shortly after, Spring Boot 2.0 was released. And then, fall of 2022, Spring Framework 6.0 was released. This does require Java 17 or higher, while Spring Framework 5 will support Java versions 8 through Java 17, possibly 18. I think I've seen some release on that, but they do not plan on supporting any further Java versions than 18, I believe. And then also Spring Boot 3.0 is released. This is going to be working in conjunction with Spring Framework 6.0. Now, there's often confusion between Spring Framework and Spring Boot. Spring Framework is a collection of framework libraries. This is what's going to be doing things like dependency injection, web transactions, or transaction management. It's a lot of libraries, and it gives you the raw tools for that. Spring Boot is really automated tooling for Spring Framework applications. You can think of Spring Boot as a wrapper around Spring. You can use Spring Framework without Spring Boot. I'm not sure why you'd want to, but you can. However, you cannot use Spring Boot without Spring Framework. Spring Boot is highly dependent on Spring Framework. Now, this diagram here, this is out of the Spring Framework documentation. This tells you the major components of the Spring Framework. So you have data, access, and integration. You have things like JDBC, JMS, transactions, object relational mapping. Then you have a set of libraries for dealing with web, so creating web services, both serverlet and reactive. I don't think people use portlets anymore. That is an older technology. but you also have WebSockets. Then you have things like aspect-oriented programming, instrumentation, messaging, and then inside the core container, we'll be getting into this a lot within the course. We'll be talking about Spring Beans, the context, Spring Expression Language. These are all tools to help you build applications. And then Spring also does have a number of very rich and robust testing features. Spring Boot, this has a number of different features for it. You can think of Spring Boot starter dependencies. These are curated dependencies. Often when you try to bring in a component, you'll actually need several dependencies. Spring Boot does provide the starters for this. And then it also has sensible auto configuration. So if you include a dependency based on finding those classes on the class path, Spring Boot will do auto configuration. So for example, if you have an H2 database on the class path, Spring Boot will auto-configure an in-memory database for you for your rapid application development. Spring Boot also does externalized configuration. It's actually fairly robust. You can do it via files or environment variables, and there are other options there, but the externalized configuration of Spring Boot is very robust. Spring Boot also does logging auto-configuration, performance metrics, health check endpoints, and it does have enhanced failure information. Then within the Spring umbrella, there are a number of Spring projects. This is not a comprehensive list of all the Spring projects, but these are some of the more major, more popular Spring projects that are available for use out there. Spring Data is actually a collection of projects built around the repository pattern of persisting data. There's projects for SQL databases as well as a number of NoSQL databases. I forget how many actual Spring Data projects there are, but there are quite a few of them. But it gives you a really great common way to persist data, kind of abstracts your persistence layer from your application. Spring Cloud is tools for distributed system. This is a very robust set of tools for building distributed systems, works well with building microservices and deploying them to the cloud. Spring Security is very popular for authentication and authorization. This is your go-to library or project for securing your applications. Spring Session, if you are using web application sessions, this will provide you with distributed sessions for high scalability. Spring Integration, this is one of my favorite projects. This provides for enterprise integration patterns, very popular area. And then Spring Batch, believe it or not, people still do batch processing. This is a set of tools for doing batch processing. And then finally, Spring State Machine. This is an open source state machine. I've used it. I really like Spring State Machine. It is a real handy tool. It's something to look at if you need to use a state machine.